Kiechel Fine Art, we treasure a relationship with the Buffett Center. Colleen and Amy, thank you so much. It's what you do as far as the artwork for the center and putting together programs is rarely matched. I'd also like to give some additional thanks to Chloe Osi, who runs my gallery, organizes my life, helps curate the shows, puts together the auctions, put together this, had to sit through this talk a few times now, so she's thank you. I
Anytime.
couldn't do it without you. And my son Luke. Now a little history of Kiechel Fine Art. We were formed in 1986 by my mother Vivian Kiechel. At that time, I was 13 years old, the same age as my youngest son. I joined the business in the year 2000, and we've evolved from there. We're located on 12th and O Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. Our original gallery was in South Lincoln, and then the opportunity came for us to buy an O Street presence, and we took an old historical 1890s building and transformed it into an art gallery near campus open to the public 5 days a week. Here are the artists we're going to be going down now. I'm sorry to do any sort of disservice to any of these artists. It is hard to summarize 11 artists' career in under an hour, but we'll try to get that done here. The first now regionalism. When we talk about regionalism revisited. I mean, regionalism was defined as the regionalism flourished in the years between the two world wars and captured classic images of the American scene, especially in small towns, farms, fertile landscapes of the Midwest. Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, Grant Wood of Iowa, and John Steuart Curry of Kansas created the regionalist trinity of the 1930s. The first artist that we're going to be talking about, and really one of the most fascinating of the three regionalists, is Grant Wood. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any audio of Grant Wood talking. A lot of Grant is lost to time. Grant started in the start of Grant's career. He was trained. He spent time in France, in Germany, and his artwork was very impressionistic. Upon returning to Iowa in 1928, he began what became best known as his traditional regionalist style. Unfortunately, his life was cut short. He passed away when he was 49 years old, and it created a limited window, of his artwork. Only 38 paintings exist that would mark the time between Grant Wood's return from Germany in 1928 and his death in 1942. Now, Grant is best known for American Gothic, the classic of the farmer and his wife. Well, there's one person that wasn't so thrilled with this connotation of the painting. When this painting was released at the Chicago Art Institute show at the 1930 Chicago's World's Fair, it went viral. Viral for 1930s essentially meant it was in every newspaper and art periodical. It was reproduced. Now, some people said this is brilliant. Some people said this is trash. But one thing they all agreed on was that it was a farmer and his wife. Now, the female subject of this painting was Grant Wood's 26-year-old sister, Nan. The male subject of the painting was the Cedar Rapids town dentist who was 74 years old. Now, to get back in good graces with his sister, and I should say that Grant grew up in a traditional Midwestern family, had older brothers that embraced the farming lifestyle, but Grant spent much of his time, not in the fields doing work, but under the kitchen table drawing with his mother and his sister. He lived out his life with, living with his mother and his sister. Now, when we look at the painting of the portrait of Nan, there are some things that are very interesting. First off, this painting was painted in 1931. The first place this painting was exhibited was in 1931 at the Joslin Art Museum. 1931 was the year the Joslin opened, and this painting was hanging there during that time. Now, with Grant, especially with his portraits, there's a lot of symbolism that's involved, and a lot of we have the chick representing youth, the plum, representing fertility. But then Grant also did, a couple other things. The bat wings on her shoulders. I don't know if he was giving her a brotherly jab of calling her an old bat, or but it's unfortunately Grant was never there to tell the story. Coming back from Germany in 1929, and the painting painted in 1931, I find it interesting to see that he has a Jewish star that's included to hold the curtain back. This was before the time of Hitler, but oddly enough, in Grant Wood's portraits, there are certain elements that almost have a futuristic tense. Portrait of Nan was the one painting that Grant Wood never sold. This is it hanging in his Cedar Rapids residence when he taught at the University of Iowa. Now, one of the best examples of Grant Wood landscape can be found at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha. This is Grant Wood's Stone City. Grant Wood was the founder of the Stone City Art Colony, which still exists today, and it's just part of how this group of regionalist artists really took time and effort into pouring in to the education of the next generation of artists that was coming. Now, in Lincoln, we have another incredibly interesting portrait. This is the portrait of Arnold Pyle. Now, Wood first met Arnold when he was teaching art at McKinley High School. Arnold at the time was in 8th grade. He took Arnold under his wing, and he was one of Wood's early students that carried on with him through the years. Certain elements are going on in this painting. This painting was also given to Arnold. The title is Arnold Comes of Age. It was given to Arnold by Grant Wood as a present for his 21st birthday. We have the butterfly on the sleeve. We have the men skinny dipping in the pond and back. Now, one fascinating thing, after Grant Wood's death, Arnold was one of Grant Wood's, biggest supporters. As far as being a professional artist, Arnold retired from art in his late 20s. Went into the paper industry, and then went back to art when he was around 60 years old. Arnold was tragically died in a car accident when he was driving back from the inaugural Grant Wood days in Anamosa, Iowa in 1973. He was on a windy road and he was hit by a commercial truck. Oddly enough, 38 years before, Grant Wood painted the scene in which Arnold would tragically die. This is in the Williams College Art Collection. But this is part of, in looking into these small group of 38 paintings, there's level after level of fascination when it comes to Grant Wood. And I could go on and talk about Grant Wood for another hour, but we'll move on to the other regionalists. John Steuart Curry, born in Duvant, Kansas, trained at Chicago and Kansas City Art Institute. During his early career, worked at, as an illustrator. He and his first wife spent 1925 and 1926 in Paris studying art. On the left is an image of Curry's studio in Paris. That's in the collection of the Sheldon Art Museum. On the right is a portrait he did during his time in Paris of his first wife, Claire Derrick Curry. Upon returning from Paris in the late 1920s, Curry took on and did some of his most memorable Kansas subject matter paintings. On the left, we have Tornado over Kansas, 1929, and on the right we have Baptism in Kansas from 1928. These images were gobbled up by the East Coast audience, sort of wanting to know what goes on in that middle part of the country. However, they weren't as embraced by a lot of his Kansas patrons who felt that he painted them in somewhat of a hokey sort of lifestyle. In 1932, with the sickness of his first wife, Clara, she went and she moved in with her parents, and Curry took off and traveled with the circus for the year. During this year, Clara would also sadly pass away, but Curry created some of his most memorable paintings. We have, At the Circus, the Flying Cordonas, and his clown paintings. There's a large group of paintings which he created during this period and proved to be one of his most creative years in his life. Upon returning from the circus and this death of his wife, in 1935, he met his second wife, Kathleen Curry, whose portrait was featured on the far left. I had the pleasure of knowing Kathleen when I first started in the business. Would often drive stuff out or pick stuff up from her when she was living in Connecticut. She passed away 2 days shy of her 103rd birthday on September 10th, 2001. So it was quite interesting time. But Kathleen encouraged Curry to take a position as the first artist in residence at an American university, the University of Wisconsin. Chris Christensen was the president of the university and one of his biggest advocate, and also the subject that he used for a couple of his major paintings during that period. In the middle we have Manhunt, and on the right we have Our Good Earth. Curry's most major show during his time at Wisconsin was his Wisconsin Landscape Show. Upstairs we have the Rainbow and View of Madison, Wisconsin from Madison landscape during that show. And then shown here on the right is Wisconsin landscape, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now the WPA treated all three of these artists pretty well. Curry and Benton were able to benefit the most. But the WPA with the artist program, they basically gave funding to artists so they could create murals in public spaces, and these still exist today. Curry's most famous would be John Brown, which he painted, which is in the Kansas State Capitol, painted right outside the door to the governor's office. A year prior to him doing this painting, Wichita, Kansas, held the largest Ku Klux Klan meeting ever. Something which Curry found horrifying and ashaming, being a man from Kansas. So he wanted to make sure when the governor left his office every day, he saw the face of John Brown. Justice of the Plains at the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. is another one of Curry's WPA projects. And this next artist that we'll be talking about is Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton, he grew up in a political family. His great uncle was a famous congressman, as was his father, of lower regards. He served in the Navy during World War I, not really in a combat sort of role. They would more or less send him out to do sketches of various areas, something which I'm sure Benton accomplished very quickly, and then created what he wanted to work on. Following that period, Benton also studied art in France, and this is really the last generation that was able to do this, because we're talking 1920s, in the late 20s. By the late 30s, no one was studying art in France. Upon his mother coming out to visit him and meeting his 45-year-old girlfriend, she brought Benton back home and said, "That's enough of Paris for you." So Benton spent his adult life, both his younger life living in New York. This is where he did some of his great. We have his drillers scene from his time in New York. We also have bootleggers. He also would travel around the country. Now, not painting the people that were deemed important at the time, but Benton wanted to paint the everyman and the man that lived. This is Benton's mind strike, kind of showing some political strife that was going on during that period. It's mind strike Pittsburgh. On the back, on the back of this tin is a study for a painting called Waiting that he would finish later that year. Now in Nebraska, there are two great ones. The Joslin Art Museum has Benton's 1940 Hailstorm, which is an quintessential Benton. And the Sheldon in Lincoln, Nebraska, has Benton's 1920 Lonesome Road, which Benton did in his time traveling through the southern United States. During after Pearl Harbor and during 1942, Benton was consumed by the war. On the right, we have the American Soldier. The first painting in the series is seen in the middle, and it is entitled Again. And then we have the Sower, which has a German soldier sowing the ground with skulls. Benton was in New York during the deportation of soldiers leaving to go to Europe, and documented this in a series of his embarkation paintings, this being one example of those. Now, at the gallery right now, at the gallery we have Portrait of Nan as well. But on view at the gallery right now, we have Thomas Hart Benton's interior. This is a painting of the interior of the Thomas Hart Benton home, which is a National Historic Site in Kansas City. In this painting is Benton's 9-year-old daughter, Jessie, and the cat, Roly-Poly Kitty. And above, the portrait above Jessie is actually a portrait of his wife, Rita. But if you flip the clock ahead about 12 years on Jessie, that could be Jessie as well. At Kiechel Fine Art, we've had a close partnership with the Benton family for many decades. That's Jessie and I, with me with no beard, but Jessie passed away a couple of years ago, but I had the pleasure of working with her for 20 years. This is some examples of Benton's WPA projects. This is we have 2 examples of this hanging upstairs. We have the lithograph Huck Finn and the lithograph Jesse James, which are 2 panels of this this mural in the Missouri State Capitol. The America Today mural, which is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum and on permanent display, is another one of Benton's iconic 1930s murals, and it's great to see that the Met received the mural, hung it for an installation on Benton about 6 years ago, and then by popular demand reinstalled it as a permanent part of their collection. Now, Benton had a couple of significant students over his time. The one with the biggest name certainly is Jackson Pollock. Now, on the image below Benton and Jackson is an example of a Jackson Pollock painting while he was studying and living with the Bentons. Jackson Pollock obviously departed from Benton in the 40s and helped lead the abstract expressionist movement. Now it's oddly enough, the Benton did take some credit for this also, because Jackson did their bathroom in Martha's Vineyard with speckling blue paint. 2 other students of Benton, which we do have in this show, are Roger Medearis, who we handle the Medearis estate, and Aaron Pyle. Now, Aaron Pyle was, as Benton said, he is the closest thing to the Nebraska regionalists, but he was a true farmer artist. Two occupations which don't necessarily go hand in hand, because they both take a great deal of time. Pyle spent his adult life living in Chapel, Nebraska, and we have an example. These are some examples of later Pyle works that are at the Museum of Nebraska Art in Kearney, Nebraska. We in this exhibition have Homesteaders, which is from 1949, and this was painted during the time in which Pyle was studying under Benton. Roger Medearis, he was really a great guy, and we lost him too early. But he was Benton's prize student. Handsome guy. I know in talking with Jessie, she said, I had such a crush on Roger. And it's, but he's really just was very nice person. He and it's a good artist to work with. Here we have, in this exhibition, we have an example of Roger's later work. This is White Mountains from 2000. An example of Roger's work during his Benton time would be Sweet Betsy from Pike from 1948. Roger took a couple of decades off from painting in the 1960s and 70s, coming back to it in the last 2 decades of his life. Now, the other Nebraska regionalist that we can't really ignore is Dale Nichols. And Dale was from David City, Nebraska. He's best known for his Midwest landscape paintings. Dale was a bit of a cat. He was married 7 times, and he was always kind of going from place to place to place to place. But wherever he was, in the world, he was always painting the Midwestern scenes, sending them back to Nebraska. He was, as far as a student, his great niece, who we just lost last year, Ruth Nichols, had an art studio outside of David City, Nebraska, in which she took on art students throughout her life. And Ruth was sweet. We loved her, but I'm sorry to say, these are a couple of perfect examples of the Dale Nichols winter red barn snow sort of landscape. On the left, we have End of the Hunt, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, and Morning Chore, which is in the collection of the Bone Creek Museum of Agrarian Art in David City, a museum that was really set up to help honor, the tradition of Dale Nichols. Dale spent much of his time in Guatemala. On the left, we have a Mayan wind god, which was produced by a rubbing from a stone in Guatemala. On the right, we have wife number 4 or 5, but this is Dale. This is, it's just Dale also, had 2 stints in Alaska, in which he produced some of his most classic paintings. In 1948, his Saturday Evening Post painting, Alaska for Sale. We were fortunate enough to have this painting and sell it to a Nebraska collection. So it still resides, in the state. At the very end of his life, Dale went back to Nebraska. This is Evening Star with White Seabird, Alaska, 1988. This is in our collection. He was using aerosol paints in a much looser sort of style. And, it's nice to see an artist that was still experimenting at this stage. But I've never seen Dale Nichols. Dale didn't pass away until 1995, when he passed away in Sedona, Arizona. The people he was around didn't realize that he was a famous artist, but he's since and he died relatively penniless. The town of David City paid for his burial. He left a great deal of paintings to the town of David City, which were hanging in their schools and in their libraries. And the Bone Creek Art Museum's done a great job of gathering these paintings, and you can see many of them in their museum space in David City. Now we get on to our modern day regionalists. Now these are the regionalists, these are the artists amongst us, except for Dan Howard, who passed away last year, but who paint the Midwest scene now. These are the artists who are assisting the next generation of artists coming along and passing along their crafts. We're going to start out with Keith Jacobs-Hagan. Keith was born in Wichita, Kansas. You know, I've had the honor of knowing Keith since I was about 9 years old. Keith is uses thin layers of paint, and his subjects are about 100 miles circumference around Lincoln. He was trained as a graphic designer at the Kansas City Art Institute, and then went to Hallmark Cards in Kansas City to become an illustrator. In 1967, he took off and lived in California for a year before accepting a teaching position at the University of Nebraska in 1968. The Crow Call in the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. This is sort of a quintessential Jacobs-Hagan canvas. You've got your 15 to 20% land with the deep, detailed horizon line, and and that sort of endless Nebraska sky. A lot of Keith credits a lot of his perspective from his time flying with his father, and and he also has his pilot's license. Keith oftentimes will go out scouting, and when he does, he will create these. These are, he'll give a time, he'll give a place, he'll give a location, and it's really great documentation of the Midwest and the Midwest architecture and just how it is. Now, in 2011, Keith had a show that opened at the Bemis Center in Omaha, and then came to our gallery. This was Keith's golden year. Now, in Keith's golden year, he wanted to paint that golden hour, the hour before dark, for every day of the year, wherever he was. The top middle painting, 5/3/2010, is actually a New York City landscape painted from a view of the top of his hotel in New Jersey. And so it was really a fascinating series. There's Keith. And currently at the gallery, we have a show up for Keith Jacobs-Hagan. Field Studies to Paintings, 50 years of Jacobs-Hagan. In this show, we're exploring how he takes a lot of these studies that he may have done years ago, and still utilizes them when he goes back to his studio to create his canvases. A couple of interesting things which we were able to uncover from this show. We have the grain elevator outside of Lincoln, Nebraska at 33rd and Cornhusker, painted in 1980, and which he also used in his last year's painting of Weather Change. Now we have Corn Crib from 1980, and I had a couple of weeks ago, I had a client in see Keith's show, and he looked at the Corn Crib and he said, "I know exactly where that is." He's like, "It's outside of Valparaiso, Nebraska." He marked it on my Google Maps, and so I just last Friday, I'm like, "All right, Keith, we got a little road trip ahead of us." I'm like, we're gonna head out, and we went and we found the Corn Crib, and both Keith and the Corn Crib are still standing. Now Dan was born, raised, and educated in Iowa, earning both his BA and MFAs from the University of Iowa. He served as a faculty member for 3 state universities: Arkansas State, Kansas State, And for 22 years, he was at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, serving as a department head from 1974 to 1983. When the university mandated the use of computers in 1997, Dan retired. Dan, up until his death last year, was the only person I knew that never owned a cell phone. But Dan retained his Dan retained a studio at the university and continued to paint 3 to 4 times a week every day until his death. Now here we have an example of Dan's process. He would start out with a photo, an image that he would find in a magazine or wherever, and something that interested him. He would then do a pen and ink drawing of this, which would then evolve into his oil on canvas. He found inspiration from several topics, some of them being the great classic painters. We have one of my favorite series of Dan was his Caravaggio Revisited series. This is on the top. We have Dan Howard's version of the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, and on the bottom we have the original by Caravaggio. Dan was also inspired by comics. On the left, we have the super duper Dagwood sandwich on a blue plate. And then on the right, his homage to Herman and his Crazy Cat comics. Now we go on to Omaha's great landscape artist. Now, when you look at Keith, when you think about the great landscape artists of Nebraska, really there are 2 names that prominently come into mind: Hal Halund and Keith Jacobs-Hagan. Now, they're totally different in their style and all this, whereas Keith is an evening painting, Hal is primarily a morning painting and captures the Midwestern morning and his impressionist styles. Now, Hal graduated from Hastings College with a master's degree from the University of Wyoming in Laramie in the 60s. Hal was program director at the Stir Museum from 1972 to 81. Hal has taken on many students that have studied under him and have been influenced by his work. But let's start from the beginning when we talk about Hal. Here are some of Hal's earlier works that are fabulous in their own right. Interior with Oranges, 1968. We have Sweet Georgia, 1974. And then we have the portrait from 1969, really involved, kind of diving right into that late 60s art scene. Now, in the one of my favorite series of Hal's are his truck stop paintings. In the 70s and 80s, I guess Hal spent some time hanging around truck stops. Just kidding. But really in creating some wonderful canvas. We're playing on the trucks and the light and the rains and in the dark. He also did some of his small town Nebraska paintings, like the B&M Bar, which he started in 1980 and completed before an exhibition we had for him in 2023. Wow. And some of Hal's earlier landscape paintings can be found here. We have a landscape North Loop River. A great deal of Hal's subjects are found right within the Omaha airport, and he is sort of the man when it comes to creating the Omaha scene. And Grazing Horses, Kemptar Farm from 1987. In 2008, Hal dove into his reflective series. In this series, Hal was painting what he saw in the water and putting it on the canvas, and it's really it's a fascinating series of paintings. And so we had a reflective exhibition for him, I believe in 2008 or 2009. But what we all know and love the most from Hal are, his Omaha or his Nebraska landscapes. We have Morning Cloud from 2012. We have Abiding Spirits from the same period. It's interesting to see the cloud and sky composition in all seasons of the year. In this exhibition, we have Midsummer Loop River from 2003, and just another one of my favorites, the Elkhorn River Valley, 2017. I've had the pleasure of, knowing Hal and representing him for, decades. I've known him since I was a little kid, and I've been picking up and delivering stuff from his house from the time I had a driver's license. And, it's, I'm honored to have spent so much time and so many years with Hal, and being here. The next artist we have is Miss Jenny Kruger. And Jenny kind of finds herself in the Midwest. She's really, she grew up kind of a citizen of the world. She earned her BA from Washington University in St. Louis. She received the Fulbright Scholarship in Barcelona, Spain. And since then, Jenny has since 2021, she's served as the Dean of Communication and Fine Arts at Iowa Community College. Now with Jenny, she has what is described as elegant realism. The patterns and the colors and she like going back to the original regionalists, likes to paint the people that she finds in the Midwest and involve her intricate backgrounds to kind of give them life and depth and kind of tell about their character oftentimes too. And she does as well with her farm scenes and her farm animals. One of my favorite things that she does, or if we go on to the next slide, Jenny's barns. I'm always after Jenny to do more barns because, well, they sell like hotcakes. But it's incorporating her floral backdrops and patterns within the Midwest, the Midwest scene, and it's sort of the Kruger fingerprint upon her work, and we're proud to represent Jenny at Kiechel Fine Art. Now, the last artist I'm going to talk about here is Aaron Holtz. Aaron's been, Aaron has been at the University of Nebraska as a professor of painting and drawing for the last 21 years. There's really no one at the university that's had a greater influence on the students coming out, on directing them, teaching them how to use their own voice and their own artistic skill sets. Aaron is also he's an art historian. He knows kind of where everything sort of comes from, and he's also specialized. He's also well versed in the contemporary artist and what's going on now. I will say when I have an art question, often my first call is to Aaron. Now, when Aaron first arrived at the university, he was best known for his portraits, and these are three examples of Aaron's portraiture. Now this is my son Graham right here when he was about 3 years old, meeting with Aaron, and Graham is in the front row and now 13 and rolling his eyes. But Aaron did a portrait of each one of my children. This is so when my oldest son is in back and he's 25 years old. So so Aaron was very happy when he realized I was having another child, because he realized he then would get another portrait commission. Now, abstraction and illusion can be best used to describe Aaron's still life work. They're fascinating in their depth, in the patterns, in the colors that are used. We have the lemons in the middle, and I never promised you a rose garden, babe. Now, Aaron's flowers have, well, I guess we'll get to that. Let's go on to landscapes. In Aaron's landscapes, are hyper energetic with a sensibility that can border on the surreal. The most important thing with Aaron's landscape is the place he's doing. He had Pine Ridge and Wounded Knee, and trying to take the energy from that place and pull it out there into a landscape, and one of many in Turtle Island and Turtle Island too. I've been proud to represent Aaron since 2005, 6. Pretty early on, and it's wonderful seeing his evolving artwork. These are 3 of his most recent still lifes, transitioning from portrait to Cherokee Rose, Triple Bloom, and Single Bloom. One of the most exciting things that we have working right now are Aaron is currently in the midst, I think, working on painting 6 right now of his Cancer Fighter series. These paintings are all tondos, and they feature plants that are used in chemotherapy. Natural plants that are used to create the drugs to help to cure cancer. These 3 are in the April Sampson Cancer Center in Lincoln. There are a couple more that are coming. These are 2 others that he's working on. We're lucky to have one for this exhibition, but they're large, powerful paintings, done in many layers to give the plants depth and to kind of bring everything out and transitioning between the colors.